Everyone. It's 9 o'clock California time and 17 o'clock in Edinburgh. So I want to welcome everybody to our next session. And it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce Professor Michele Salzman. I think on one level, she needs no introduction at all. Michele is certainly the leading scholar of late antique Rome and the city of Rome in the English-speaking world and probably the world full stop. We all know her earlier work, which has charted for us the Codex Calendar of 354, which shows the rhythms of life in the city of Rome in late antiquity, her work on the Christianizing of the Roman aristocracy, her work on Symmachus's letters, and her most recent monograph right here, The Falls of Rome, which faded out for a second, is a really, really wonderful next part in the conversation Michele has been having with us for years. This, I think, represents just an impressive and really fundamentally outstanding capstone to the sequence of books and scholarly articles and other work that Michele has done, examining the city of Rome and its aristocrats across late antiquity. This volume is absolutely magistral. It extends from the 3rd century through the 7th century, and it offers us a master narrative that traces the resilience of the city of Rome and its aristocrats in the face of political upheaval, military attack, enemy sacks, and the recovery from all of these things. And what the Falls of Rome does is it offers a sort of definitive treatment of the evolution of the city and its Senate and their interaction across all of late antiquity. And so this is, on one level, a prosopographically rich study that helps us understand the evolution of the Senate and the city around it, but it also provides us with really significant background to show and understand and contextualize the careers of individual senators as they operated in a city that they all loved. And these discussions focus primarily on how senators interact with their city and how their influence on the urban fabric of Rome make the city and its civic life uniquely resilient in late antiquity. And so this means that what Michele has done is entered into a kind of third way to think about the decline and fall or the transformation of the Roman world in late antiquity. What she's asking us to do and what she succeeds in getting us to do is to focus on the way that the society responded to change and to crises. So she acknowledges disruption and destruction and political collapse. But the story she tells is also one of resilience and recovery. And the scope of the narrative makes it a particularly useful one in forcing us to reconsider what it meant to be Roman by focusing on the evolution of a city that was, and still is, fundamentally Roman. And so in her view, there was a continuity with the Roman past across late antiquity, but there was also a moment when the state ceased to function. And throughout it all, what Professor Salzman shows us is that there remained a city of Rome and a Roman aristocracy that was interested in helping it rebound from crises for a very long time. And so I want to turn things over to Michele so she can really walk us through the really wonderful arguments and materials that she's assembled in this incredible book.
Oh, well, I want to thank you, Ed. That was a wonderful introduction. And, it's so rewarding when you write a book when someone gets it. I really, really appreciate that. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really, I don't know if I could follow up quite as well. But yeah, I thank you all for coming, and thank you, the organizers, for having me. This book really grew out of frustration with the pre-existing frameworks for understanding the last 3 centuries of the city of Rome's existence in the Roman Empire, and also living through the pandemic. I will be honest. I was frustrated with what I see as a catastrophist narrative that associated most famously with Edward Gibbon's decline and fall notion of a kind of biological necessity for the decline of the city of Rome. The barbarians, the emphasis on the military, and all of those moments of defeat. And I was also similarly frustrated with the sort of transformationalist paradigms associated most famously perhaps with Peter Brown's work. Yes, there is continuity, but there was also rupture, there was break, there were loss. However, I chose, in the words of one of my favorite poets, Adrian Rich, to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And that's really what I was trying to look at, how the Romans over the last 3 centuries of the Western Empire really reconstitute their existence in the city of Rome. The impact of individual choices, I trace individuals and also collective choices through the Senate primarily during these centuries to move beyond these narratives of decline and fall or simple transformation. And so I focus on the city of Rome because of Rome's influence, which shaped the outlines of the Mediterranean Empire. And in late antiquity, as I show, it remains still the largest city in the Western Empire, with a resident aristocracy who were devoted to time again to return to Rome, to rebuild, to reconstitute their world, even in the face of a series of military and political disasters that modern historians tend to see as the end of Rome. Indeed. So in this book, as Ed noted, I examine 5 political and military crises that both ancient writers as well as modern historians have considered critical for the decline and fall of Rome. And I look at how the Romans recovered this city in order to offer this alternative paradigm. And so the fortunes of Rome's leaders, its senators, emperors, generals, and bishops, certainly ebbed and flowed. Certainly the population declined, there was physical damage, but the central aristocracy remained at the center of the city's recovery. And I use the concept of resilience, the resilience of Roman senatorial aristocrats who time and again marshaled their resources monetarily and in terms of people to fuel the city's resurgence after a series of sacks or civil wars. This is really the very definition of resilience used by social scientists who study responses really to environmental shocks like plagues and climate change. But in my book, I use the term resilience to consider how Roman elites adapted to the military and political crises that overtook the city. So trying to get at why they returned after Constantine took the city and there was a civil war, after the famous sack of Rome in 410, after the Vandal capture of the city in 455. Why they did so is also part of my narrative. And I think, to understand that, I had to take into account the fact that central aristocrats were really products of a culture in which competition for influence and prestige acted as a stimulant that continually revived individuals to recommit to returning to Rome and rebuilding it. And over the course, especially of the 5th century, and there are 3 chapters devoted to the 5th century crises, personal relations played an even greater role than even previously in winning power. And I trace the way individuals built social networks that enabled them to restore their city. And at times there were missteps, there were mistakes. Petronius Maximus's coup in the year 455 led to the Vandal capture of the city. He was an overly ambitious senatorial aristocrat who became emperor. But nevertheless, there was a recovery after the Vandal capture. So I trace, using inscriptions and texts as well as material evidence, the restoration of the period in the immediate decade after each of these various disasters. One of my favorite chapters, I think, has to do with why Gibbon was wrong. And I take on the very sort of the standard view that the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, and that was the end of when the last Roman emperor in the West disappeared. 476 is the conventional date for the fall of the Roman Empire, and Edward Gibbon even thought that he might end his history in that year. But then he changed his mind. But for Rome, as I argue, that's an extremely misleading date. because in fact, there was a crisis in Rome in 470, leading to a civil war in 472, which was resolved. And so by 476, the city was actually recovering. It was rebuilding and then restoring itself. And when the senators go to the Eastern Emperor and argue that we no longer need a Western Emperor, we have one in the East. We don't need one. We're happy with the military general Odoacer. I trace how there were all these negotiations behind the scenes in which they are really happy to no longer have a resident Western Empire, and how in the aftermath of 476, Roman senators and the Senate become newly invigorated, powerful, important negotiators on the political scene. And in fact, they took advantage of the opportunities of not having a resident Western Empire. And so really the aristocratic response to the civil war in 472 and the support for Odoacer in 476 enabled the rise of the Germanic kingdoms, eventually of Theodoric, and in many ways a very fruitful and peaceful period for the city of Rome at the end of the 5th and early 6th century. What was one of the surprising things was the ways in which the central aristocracy remained the strong civic institution throughout the 4th, 5th, and into the 6th centuries, that they were the dominant civic leaders and not the bishops of Rome, down through, I would say, to the Gothic Wars. And I trace their interactions with various bishops to demonstrate that really the bishops of Rome, unlike in other cities, bishops of Rome were not the dominant political figures that medievalists looking backwards often think that they are. So at the end of after 476, the Senate becomes extremely important for the Bishop of Rome, Felix, during the Acacian Schism. And we even have letters from the Eastern Emperor to the Senate of Rome to try to get them to get the Pope to agree with them. It's just one example of how much importance the Senate really has. And so I think the book really has answers many questions for me, including what happened to Rome in the end and what happened to the end of the Senate. And one of the surprising things for me, and I sort of changed my earlier work actually, was to see that I think the Senate disappeared and the central aristocracy disappeared, not as a result of the Gothic War in the 6th century, but more so because of the Justinianic reconstitution after the wars, which cut senators out from any real sort of civic role and reduced the reasons for their returning to the city after the Gothic Wars. And it's with the Justinianic reconstitution that we see the declining political engagement for the central aristocracy in the second half of the 6th and early 7th century, much, much later than I had thought. So that's one of the sort of surprising moments in the book, but I hope you'll find many more, and I look forward to further discussion.